Welcome, social media. We're going to be kicking things off with Kristin Hannah tonight on the Veterans Breakfast Club. Thank you all for joining us. We'll start the music and we'll let everybody into the room. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club Scuttlebutt for Monday, September 23rd. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the VBC, and I'm seeing so many new faces here in the room. We have a great program lined up for you. Daria Summers is here to host a very engaging and I'm sure exciting program with Kristin Hannah. Daria, would you like to wave?
Right here. I'm so excited to be
How are
here
you doing?
with Kristin Hannah.
We're excited to have you both. And for so many new names in the room, I just want to let everybody know that we are the Veterans Breakfast Club. And our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing it for 16 years. The last 4 years, we've been doing it online. We are here every Monday night at 7 p.m. And we will be coming back with our every Thursday night programs next Thursday. I'll get to a little bit more of that later. You can check out everything there is to know about us on our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org. We invite you to check that out. All of our past programs are on there, our upcoming live and in-person events, interviews, blog, and we invite you to donate and become a member of the VBC to help us to continue to, as we say in the nonprofit world, keep the lights on. But that's enough for me. Excited to get on with the program. Dari, take us away.
Thank you, Sean. I just want to welcome everyone and just say what an honor it is to welcome Kristin Hannah to our Monday Night Veterans Breakfast Club program. As probably everyone knows, but it still bears repeating, Kristin is the best-selling and award-winning author of more than 20 novels. Her latest, The Women, tells the story of a young woman who serves 2 tours as an Army nurse in Vietnam and returns home to a divided nation. While The Women has become a cultural phenomenon with 32 weeks on the bestseller list, I think, maybe even more now, it isn't the first book she's written about women in war. Her historical novel, The Nightingale, is about 2 French sisters who risk their lives to fight the German occupation of France. Her novel, Homefront, is about a woman helicopter pilot who, after serving a tour in Iraq, returns home with a disability that changes her family forever. And one of my favorite books, The Great Alone, in that Hannah tells the story of a young girl who tries to understand her beloved father, who is a troubled Vietnam veteran. I could go on, but I don't want to cut our time short with Kristin. So welcome. And I just need to give a few shout outs. One, I need to thank Carol Fitzgerald of the Book Report, who helped connect me and set up this program. So thank you very much, Carol. And I want to give a shout out to, we're doing a live stream with a retirement community, Concordia Lutheran Ministries in Cabot Lodge, Pennsylvania. And I promised I wouldn't give away any spoilers, and we won't, because I know at their library, they have 1 copy of The Women, and they have an 89-person wait list. So and on the off chance that my aunt made it, my aunt is 97 years young. She's a nurse in Duluth, Minnesota. And although she did not serve in Vietnam, she worked with nurses who did. So if my Aunt Mary Lou is here, I say hello. So let's begin. And Sean, we wanted to mention that as we go through the program, at different junctures, if people have a question or they have a story or a thought they want to share, you should put it in the chat, and Sean will get it, and he'll let me know, and then we can make it a more interactive program so we don't have to save all the questions for the very end. But as we begin, I had thought of just, how did you, opening questions, how did you come to write this novel or that? But I thought, actually, one of the things one of our members, he was a medical technician in 1966, and he served at the 36th evac hospital. And he no, he not the 36th. He served anyway. He served at one of the evac hospitals, and he told me a story. And I think his mic, Sean, you said his mic was not working. Clems, okay,
Yeah, unfortunately.
but he told me this. He wrote me out the story, and he said he was working in the evac hospital as a technician, and he was taking blood tests or something, and all of the certs, and there was a nurse behind him with a tray, and all of a sudden he heard this loud noise, and and he turned around, and the tray had fallen onto the ground, and everything had spilled, and the nurse was there doing chest heaves to a patient who Clem realized he was having a heart attack, and she saved his life. And so it just made me think, well, those were the women. And so I just wanted to ask you, like, you could write a book about other veterans, and you wouldn't call them the men. I mean, or it would land differently. And I was just wondering why you called it the women.
Well, thank you, and hello to everybody. I am extremely honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to all of your questions. I didn't think we'd start with the title, but I will dive right in. And actually, the title for this book was a really, it was a difficult process. I'm not particularly good at titles anyway. And this one, I wrote the book for 3 years, and I spent at least a full year with my team, my editor, my agent, trying to title it. And nothing ever, quite felt right. And I kept saying, can we just call it The Women? And everyone I pitched that to said, that's a terrible title. What women? It doesn't tell you anything about the book. Why would anyone, pick up a book called The Women? And so we kept sort of going back and forth on this. And then as I noticed Diane Carlson Evans' book is in the background there. So Diane was my, my mentor, my guide, my everything for this. And I remember when I pitched the title to her, she said, that's a terrible title. It doesn't say anything. Why would anyone buy a book called The Women? And then she signed it, Diane Carlson Evans, one of the women. And the minute I saw that sentence, I went, okay, that's my title. And, then we had to have all kinds of conversations about how do I then place it? And my answer was put a helicopter on it. And if you have the women and a helicopter, there's a sense of, what it's about. And everywhere I go, I talk to, people who say, I was one of the women. I was one of the women. My mom was one of the women who served. And so I think it's turned out to be a title that I love. And so there you go. That's that story.
I love it. I think it says so much. And it just places it a certain way. So now we'll begin more traditionally, and I know there's a interesting backstory, a thread of how you came to write this book, and perhaps you could share that with us.
Sure. So I am just a little bit younger. I was a kid when the Vietnam War started. In 1969, I was 9 years old, and I was living in a very small town in Washington. And my best girlfriend and I, we were like, horse riding buddies who, spent all of our time together. And her father was a pilot, and he was shot down and lost. And as you all know, we wore those, POW bracelets. And so I got my bracelet with his name on it when I was 10, I believe. And the idea, of course, was that we didn't take it off until he came home. And so, we moved away, we moved to other towns, and, I lost touch with Susan, but I was always wearing this bracelet, and I wore it all through college, and kept wearing it. And literally, as soon as the internet came, one of the first things I did was look up whether he had returned, and he hadn't. And so this man's name and the date that he was lost was literally on my body for years and years. So it was always in the forefront of my mind, even though I wasn't from a military family. And then, of course, so many of the vets coming home were my friends' fathers. And so I saw how they were treated. And I think these two things just stayed with me. And so I always wanted to go back and write about and explore this era and try to understand it a little bit more from an adult perspective. And when I was, I guess, 35, so 25 years ago or so, I told my editor that this was the book I wanted to write. I wanted to write about the Vietnam era. And my editor, who's 10 years older than I am, said, you aren't ready, you aren't good enough. And frankly, the world doesn't want to read about the Vietnam War yet. So just, wait. And so I did. And, every couple of years I would think to myself, okay, am I old enough? Am I good enough? Do I know what I have to say? Am I ready? And I kept shelving it because it was really a daunting task to take this on. I still never knew if I was the only one who was interested in this and the only one who wanted to talk about it, or if, there was a huge readership for it. So I just kind of kept waiting. And then in March of 2020, when we in Seattle went on COVID lockdown, I was, watching the news, as we all were, and seeing how divided the country was. And I started thinking, boy, this feels like the Vietnam era again, all of this dissension, all of this anger, all of, the two sides. And then I was watching the nurses who were doing so much and giving so much and not always getting the support that I felt they needed. And that's when the whole book clicked into place. I said, okay, I'm going to write my Vietnam era book, and it's going to be about the nurses.
Wow. And had you just finished Homefront, or was that later? Were you doing the two?
Oh gosh. No, Homefront. Now you're going to test me here.
It's okay. Publishing. Who knows when it came out?
I think it's a decade or more ago.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
All right. I just wanted to ask. So, and when you decided to write about this period, did you specifically think and know?
Go. I can't find you.
Hopefully Daria did not just fall off.
Oh. I wonder what she was going to ask.
Yeah, I know. She may have had internet trouble. Not a problem. We've dealt with technical difficulties before. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us. I guess going along that same line, if you, as the women started to gain in popularity and it was released and you started to hear more and more sort of reviews and people talking about it, how did that influence the way that, whenever you first started building all that difficulty of like, am I ready for this? Did it sort of feel good once you started hearing things about it?
Well, it was interesting. So like I said, it took me about a year to research. It took me, and then 2 years to write. And in that third year, when I had the book largely finished, and I was gearing it up to be the book that you read versus the book I originally write of it, which is not nearly as good a version. And I started becoming very stressed out about having written this, what people call a historical novel, this historical novel where I knew that people would be reading it who had lived through this period and knew a lot more about, the war and the situation and all of it than I did. And, so I was relying on my research because, again, I wrote this book during COVID. So it wasn't like I had access to going and doing the things I normally would have done in terms of interviews or travel. And so I realized I needed some help. And I did what we all do now. I went online and I knew that it was Diane and her book Healing Wounds, that she was the one that I wanted to talk to. And it took me about 4 or 5 months to track her down. And we both say now that it's like my mother, who I lost when I was very young, had to have put us together somehow, because Diane has been such a remarkable addition to my life. And it wasn't really until Veterans Day of last year. So I write the book and then the book is done. And then it takes a year to get to the market. Mm-hmm. So in this year, I'm, going on to other things and moving forward. And Diane invited me to the 30th anniversary of the Women's Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. And going to that event was the first notice that I had that the women was really speaking to people who I wanted to speak to, and I think were waiting to be heard from. And they hadn't read the book yet. They'd only heard about it from Diane. But watching these, there were probably 150 nurses and donut dollies and other women who had served in that period, and their children and their spouses, standing at this memorial during what they call storytelling and telling their stories. And it was probably one of the most emotionally powerful experiences of my life. And that's when I first thought, I am so proud, to have told this story. And I'm so proud to have told these women's stories. And I just hope that I did it well. And then you just, kind of wait and see. In terms of, the cultural effect of it, that has been somewhat of a shock. Yeah.
Daria is back.
Yeah, I'm back. I don't know, internet gremlin, sorry. When one of the things that you do so well in the book that just kind of launches it, your main character Frankie, it early on she's kind of her very much of her time, like basically of the 50s. It's the early 60s, but her expectations are like maybe be a teacher or then get married and have children, but she yearns for something more. But there's a moment that just kind of sparks something for her. And I love the way you describe it, because, and I was just wondering how you got to this moment when she has this feeling of, wow, because her father has a wall of heroes that are all the military men. And she's like, and someone says to her, women could be heroes too. And she gets this in her head. And that's like the beginning. And I feel like it's this, this sense of like, well, women want to serve their country. Women feel patriotic. Women want to participate. How did you, and you set it up so beautifully. It's so natural. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I really felt what when you talk about, say, writing about the women, which I'm really kind of writing about one woman who stands in for the experience of hundreds of women. I'm looking for a really representative experience, something that, people are going to read, other nurses are going to read and say, well, I knew her, or she was like someone I knew, or she was me. I wanted that kind of, relatability in Frankie. And in doing, thanks, Terry, in doing the research, what I saw was, that the great number of these women who volunteered to serve over there, they were young. they were inexperienced in nursing. They did come from the families of the greatest generation who talked glowingly and with pride about their families, World War II service. And then they got in country and they tended to be sort of woefully unprepared. And so that's where that part of it comes from. The part about, her father's heroes wall, that was really a way to express this idea that, that sometimes what men want for their sons isn't what they want for their daughters, and that there is this societal sort of issue with women serving. I remember when I was writing Homefront about the female helicopter pilot, who deploys to Iraq, hearing her tell me very casually, well, we weren't in combat. And she's flying a Black Hawk. And I'm thinking, that's about definitions. And it was really important to me in writing this book, because one of the things the nurses tended to hear when they came home was they couldn't have PTSD because they hadn't been in combat. And so I really wanted to show what these hospitals were like and what these women were dealing with. And I wanted you as the reader to understand how certainly not everybody's going to be, profoundly impacted by that. But to me, it makes more sense that you are than that you aren't, given the horrifics of what you're dealing with.
No, I think that makes a good point. It's also the other thing you do is you introduce this idea that, and it may seem naive to us now looking back, but probably most of us also can remember how important it felt. Like there was this idea that you were going to do good because you were going to defend democracy and freedom, and it wasn't just empty words. It actually, my father's whole life was based on that.
Right. Well, that was very much, the domino theory of communism, and people came into this from the 50s, and this idea of, protecting democracy, fighting for democracy, holding off communism, all of that really resonated with people in the beginning.
That's right. Sean, do we have any, does anyone have any questions or want to share anything yet? Or should I just continue?
If you'd like to continue, just a couple things in the chat about, we've read the book. I just completed the book. We were at a book club and we finished it. We wore bracelets back at that time, but feel we grew up even more in a bubble. But thank you for making the world more aware of our Vietnam veterans, especially the women.
There you go. The other thing is, the other thing that you portrayed, which I really loved, was the way, Vietnam was its own reality, and you really created that well. And I know it's not like you wrote during pandemic. It's not like you went to Vietnam, or even, it was really through the history and through your research, which I think is so incredible. But just this idea that when, whatever they were preparing you for, an army, if you were going to be an army nurse, you make that point. It didn't require all that much preparation, as opposed to if you were going to be in the Navy. But you went over, and I think Frankie shows up, and within 24 hours, she's working.
Yeah, it was amazing to me too. To read these women's experiences, and if you look in the back of the book, there are, I can't remember, probably 5 or 10 particularly remarkable books written by female vets. One of them, is it Home Before Morning? I think.
Yes.
Linda Van de Vanner. Yeah. Winnie Smith wrote one, and so reading these women's accounts they were so astounding to me. And the more I read, this is the same thing I had with Nightingale, the same thing I had with Homefront. It's one of the things that drives me to write a novel, is the more I read the angrier I became. And not just on behalf of the women, on behalf of, all of the Vietnam vets and the way they were treated upon coming home, and for their children and their spouses, and for the help that wasn't there for them. And so the more I got into all of this, I think the more the story took root, and the more it became as much about coming home as about going to war. Because when I began it, it really was just going to be about the war experience, and it ended up being both.
No, and that's a great point, and we'll get to that later, because there's always two wars: the war you go to and the war you bring home, I think. But
Yeah.
But before that, the other thing was just to get this concentrated narrative of how the war appears through the eyes of the nurses. And you must have done a lot of research, not just from the accounts from the nurses themselves, but just sort of medically, because you give us such a, sort of brutal, but very visceral sense of what these evac hospitals were like, that were just so close to the fighting.
Honestly, they were so much worse than they were in my book. I mean, there were so many things that I just couldn't even, I couldn't even wrap my head around, describing, and the level of sort of commitment and strength and endurance that it took for anyone, male or female, to be there was just, it was amazing to me. But again, interestingly, in having these conversations and stuff, I've heard from nurses who were nursing during the AIDS crisis, nurses during the pandemic, and this idea of what it takes to nurse or be a doctor or be a medical professional during this level of crisis. And I think it's something that, just as a society, we have to take more notice of. We have to take more care of the people who are taking care of us. I guess that's my soapbox for the moment, but that struck me a lot.
Right. And the way you use what Frankie and the other nurses witness at the evac hospitals. Frankie's at two evac hospitals, and they're all real hospitals. You used ones that really existed and that the nurses had been at. The 36th evac hospital in Vung Tau, which is, I guess, about an hour or 60 miles outside of Saigon, and then the second one the character goes to is the 71st evac hospital in Pleiku, which is, I guess, cooler in the mountains, but nearer to the Cambodian border. So maybe perhaps, they're all treacherous, but more treacherous. But one of the things, and if anyone else who has read the book, who has thoughts on this, I personally, so I wasn't there for any of that. But I found like it's almost like you got a sense of the war through the injuries coming in. You got a sense of the kind of war it was, or with burns, or where soldiers had lost limbs, or Vietnamese babies were coming in, or when napalm was being used. You got this real sense of like this really brutal conflict, but you kind of showed it. You built up to it. You didn't give it to us all at once. You kind of like built up to it. And I thought, but at the same time, it's like that's one side of the coin. But on the other, I personally was reading it and I was thinking, wow, these women are facing this just about every single day. And what does that do to a person? And that may not be combat in a traditional sense, like as portrayed in Matterhorn by Carl Atlantis, where you're out fighting, but it's a kind of combat.
Yeah, that's certainly, I think it's incontrovertible, honestly. I don't know how anybody can argue that it isn't. But what was interesting was one of the things I was able to do, even in this, the horrificness of this this landscape and the 24/7 nature of it, I was able to sort of explore female friendship, because we've all read about, male camaraderie during war and how strong, those friendships can become. And I really saw, and again, I saw at the Vietnam Memorial when I was there, the friendships that are made in this kind of an experience can be so powerful and can anchor you. And so it was really nice to be able to, while all this bad stuff was happening, show Frankie becoming really, truly best friends with two other women who had shared her experience, but not, they didn't all have exactly the same experience, and they didn't have the same, response to it upon coming home. And I think that's important because, there's this sense out there that there's one way to go to war and one way to come home. And, there's this idea that somehow people who suffer from PTSD are different than, or less than, or more susceptible to. And I think it's important to just talk about all of this as the human condition.
Right, right. And I mean, I think I've heard veterans express, I think everybody is probably changed by war, but people manage it differently. And the range of experience is so different that it's as different as each person. And so that's hard to make that point. And because you also have, to that point, there's a very interesting moment in the book where one of Frankie's friends, who's sort of back home, but she writes Frankie a letter. Frankie's still in Vietnam, and she's like, almost has a sense of, or at one point she has a sense of nostalgia for when they were all together. And it's kind of like, not like, at first you're like, wow, like what kind of sense does that make? But on the other hand, you can kind of see it, because I think, and I got, like, if you read a book, like, as I said, like Matterhorn, and you see how the bonds go, many, like, according to that, like, you would sign up for another tour because you don't want to leave your men, or, and so Frankie signs up for another tour because she doesn't want to leave, because she's needed. And there's a sense of this kind of peak experience of you're needed. And I thought you did a really good job of portraying that as to why would Frankie sign up for a second tour.
Well, and I think too, one of the things that's so interesting, especially with women and especially with nurses, post-Vietnam, what I saw in almost, I'm trying to think if there's any that didn't say this, but what I saw in almost every primary source that I read, these women were over here, they become these amazing, competent, more than competent nurses. And then they come home. Well, they're really only 22 years old or 23 years old, and they were brand new nurses when they left. And so after having this experience and having this confidence in their own abilities, they come back to a world that wants them to, be supervised to start an IV, and wants to act like their war experience is not relevant to what they would do in a hospital. And so you can really see that if you go from, being this amazing nurse in country and having all of these experiences and all of these skills, and then you come home and you're treated like a 22-year-old recent college graduate, you could see why, there's a disconnect there. And a lot of them had trouble, going forward. A lot of them suffered from PTSD. There was no help for them. As you see in the book, what they heard over and over was there were no women in Vietnam.
That's
and,
right.
When I first heard that, in fact, I didn't want to put that sentence in the book because I thought that has to be an exaggeration. This is the mid 70s, MASH is on air. how can people not know that there were women in Vietnam? There have been, nurses in World War II and World War One. How do they not know this? And I heard Diane say to somebody who said that, she said, if you never saw a woman in Vietnam, you were lucky. It meant you weren't in a hospital.
That's right.
And people just forget. They just forget that the women were there. And I think it took a while for the women like Diane, like Linda, to start standing up for themselves and their experiences and their sister vets. And, it took Diane 10 years to get the women's memorial at great personal cost. It was really difficult to get that done. And I think it's a reminder, and I think the book is a reminder too, of how important remembrance and gratitude is toward our vets.
Well, absolutely. And I'll just say with I'm sure you're aware of Joan Fury. She was an Army nurse, and she came home. She started she was one of the women who started the Center for Women Veterans at the VA. Anyway, she came home, and I interviewed her once. She was like, for the longest time, I didn't even know I could be called a veteran. And,
Yeah.
and, I was like, what? That is shocking. That was shocking, but I think that's really true. And she didn't know she was allowed, basically to, be feeling bad after her experiences. But so, and then also she had the exact same experience you were talking about, that Frankie has, where, she, after returning, she's at she tries to get a job, but she's kind of treated almost condescendingly, with no recognition that, you might have been really working beyond most people's capacities, given you just did 2 tours in Vietnam. And she couldn't, so it was almost like she was in Vietnam, but then she had to come home and she just had to go through a whole other fight.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing. And then on top of that, depending on when you served, and I tried to show this with Frankie because it was so fascinating to me, it was almost like, you were leaving one America and coming home to a whole different America where, the music's different, the clothing's different, the politics are different. I mean, everything was different, and you don't fit in because you had missed, Frankie missed that 2-year period of 68 to 69. It's a big moment to have missed in American history.
Well, also because you picked the time period of 67, 68. So by the time she comes home, you're well, the Tet Offensive has happened. And I think that changed was a huge attitude change in this country, as people were like, well, what are we really doing over there? And I think it turned even more people against the war, which made it harder for anyone who was coming home back then, obviously not just nurses, but all the soldiers. But that's why I think it was like brilliant to just pick that time period, because it kind of just did its work for you.
It did. Yeah, it helped a lot. And one of the things that's also been really interesting, because I tried to the extent that I could to show more than just Frankie's perspective. I wanted you to know what was going on in the country while she was gone. And then she becomes involved, and Barb becomes involved with, the changes that are happening afterwards. And I have heard from so many people who have read the book who were protesters in 68 and 69, and who have been very proud of their protest and understand after reading this book the mistake that was made in, not separating the war from the soldier. And right. So that makes me happy too, that awareness is coming around too.
No, I think that's really important. It does reading that did make me think about just because this was something that I learned, and a lot of veterans who I spoke with, mostly women veterans who served in Iraq, and some in Afghanistan, told me about when you return home, you have to kind of, you're holding, even in for the Iraq War, but probably even more so for the Vietnam War, you have to hold two things. You're proud of your service. You served your country. You did your duty. You were there for the people you served with in whatever that capacity was, and you were there for the mission. And you didn't choose it. Your country chose it.
Right.
But then at the same time, if you came back and you were against the war, whether it was in the Iraq War or say even in the Vietnam War, you were protesting it. And those are two kind of that they can wear and tear on the psyche. Anyway, that's what I got. But I thought because there's a scene, where anyway, some of the women were protesting, and the men were like, "You're not vets. You can't protest."
Yeah.
And so
and it's shocking, isn't it? I mean, it really is. And although, I mean, I guess I understand to some extent that the men were being treated so badly as well, and they wanted to band together, I guess. But it's just, hopefully we've grown up and learned something. I mean, that's really the point of books like this, and hopefully there will be a lot of books that follow this, that tell a child's story, a wife's story, because the wives of vets and the husbands of vets have, a lot of difficult terrain that they had to, manage sometimes as well.
No, I mean, I think that's a really important point, and I think that's one of that's why Vietnam, I think, continues to remain such a reference point for understanding ourselves, for the culture, because so much of maybe what didn't work so well there is things we're trying to change. Hopefully. Anyway,
Well, may I chime
Yeah.
in here? There's
Yeah.
been a lot of wonderful conversation here in the chat, a lot of praise, and some anecdotes. Not so many questions, but that's okay because there's just been such lively chat here. But P. Watts did put in, serving as an Army nurse in '68 at 121 evac in Korea. We had no idea the negativity and angst that was going on in the U.S. Clem Blazewick put in here that I thought was very poignant. There was a sense of being safe and secure to be in a hospital. That is a false sense. The 93rd evac was bombed in 1968. Also, my replacement in the lab was stabbed by a VC in the ER while drawing blood from him. Safe and secure, no way. Someone did ask, Kristin, two questions I'll put in here from the chat. One was, have you been to Vietnam? And the other is, did you have any other mentors other than Diane?
I have not been to Vietnam, unfortunately. I'm dying to go, but COVID sort of knocked us for a loop, obviously. So hopefully I can go in the next year or so. And did I have other mentors? Yes, I did. Diane got me in touch with Colonel Doug Moore, who was a medevac helicopter pilot, and his wife, who was a donut dolly. And so, they were a lot of help. Actually, Diane's husband, who was a doctor, somebody just asked this question right now, Susan, he was really helpful on the medical stuff. And then Diane felt that because she wasn't a surgical nurse, I needed more help on the surgical side of it. And she connected me with Beth Parks, who is a photographer and professor now in Maine. And so that was really sort of my team. And actually, Beth Parks is on Facebook, and she, since this book coming out, has been posting a lot of great photographs of her time in Vietnam. And she shared some of those with me when I was writing the book as well. So that was a lot of help.
Kristin, how has writing this book affected your view of war and veterans?
Um, well, I mean, as you can tell, like I said, this all comes back from my childhood and um, seeing sort of through the innocent eyes of a kid what it means to come home from war and what it means when, you know, they're not treated well. And so, I mean, I am just a huge supporter of veterans, and that's why I keep trying to put these stories, you know, in front of people, because I think that the more you read a book that allows you to walk in someone else's shoes, the more sympathetic you are, the more compassionate you are, the more empathetic we all are. And that's important, obviously. You know, with regard to war, I mean, it's pretty hard to, you know, read about it and see the political and other underpinnings and come out thinking that this is the best way to solve a problem. But I guess,
Sean,
go ahead.
I think we have Terry has her hand up.
Yep, Terry, go ahead.
Sure, thanks. Hi, Kristin. Thank you so much for spending this evening with us. I was a donut dolly in Vietnam, and I put a couple comments in the chat for you. I thought the book was terrific, and as far as being a woman in Vietnam, a lot of the issues that you had Frankie dealing with were familiar to all of us women who were over there. But I had one question for you, and maybe it was explained to me in the chat just now, but when I saw the mention of donut dollies twice, both mentions talked about rolling a snack cart out onto the beach. And I don't think that's characteristic of anything we did. And someone said that one of your sources' wives was not actually a donut dolly, but they were Army Special Services. So there might have been some misunderstanding there. But I wondered what your resource was on that, because more characteristic of what we did was every morning we dressed in our blue dresses and hopped on a helicopter with our program bag and flew out to the fire bases. So I just wondered, I just wanted to make sure that there was an understanding that I don't think that's characteristic of what we did, especially if hopefully you get a movie made from this. Thank you.
Well, I will keep that in mind, Terry. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that wasn't something that I was, you know, told along the way. I think I talked about somewhere in there how tough they were and how they were going, you know, out into the bush and, you know, that kind of stuff. But since it wasn't really the focus of the story, and I didn't have there you moved again, additional character, but I appreciate that comment, and I'll remember it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, and Sean, I think we have Bill Stuggers. Yeah.
Bill, if you could unmute. There you go. Oh, we can't hear you, Bill.
Can't hear you.
Yeah. Sorry, Bill. Go ahead and give me yeah, you could try to say something real quick. No, I'm sorry, we can't hear you, Bill. If you'd like to put it into the chat, please do. Go ahead, Daria.
No, was there anything else in the chat we should, is he putting his?
Once I see something, okay. I will let you know.
So I just wanted to, this is where I wanted to kind of like go into the fact that the book is in two parts. And so there is the Vietnam part, and then there's the coming home part. And to me, that when I opened the book, that was the first thing I looked for to see actually that, you know, what the arc of it was. Because I just thought that was so important, because I think all the time, you know, consistently, it's all, there's the war you fight. And sometimes what the country has to understand is when we do send people to war, that's only the beginning, and it all comes home, and then we all have to participate in that to some extent, supporting that. but I love, I don't want to get into spoilers, but I love Frankie's arc when she returns because, and also she then reconnects with her, basically her buddies who she bonds with, Barb and Ethel. And so I thought that the fact that you showed that as a continuation because they understood,
Mhm.
they understood, and they knew what to say and what not to say and when to just leave her be. And I just was wondering how you arrived at that. Like the I mean it seems like it might have been very not straightforward, but like when you're writing the Vietnam part, she goes to the evac hospitals. It's that's pretty there's a trajectory there that makes sense, but how difficult was it to map out? Was that the harder part of the book?
The whole second half, which is, her coming home, her dealing with her family that's not supportive, her having trouble getting her career back on track, her struggling with PTSD. It was all something actually I fought very hard. I really didn't want to go into PTSD and the struggle and the difficulty. I felt that I had, sort of touched on that ground before, and I was afraid that it would, I don't know, somehow seem too ordinary, or be too much of a downer following, everything. And but ultimately, when I got down into the trenches of writing this, there just seemed to be this idea that I wouldn't really be speaking for these women if I didn't talk about the difficulty of coming home. And so I just kind of, had to dive in. And of course, because I'm a novelist, and because I have to write books that keep people interested and that have a lot of peaks and valleys, I really, when I go into war, I hit it full throttle. When I go into PTSD, I do it full throttle. I try not to pull back from the ideas that I'm writing about. And so, I know it can make it a tough book to read. At least I've heard this. I know it was a tough book to write. So
Well, I know we have a question from Susan. We'll get to it. I just wanted to say that just amongst the uh, Vietnam nurses that I had come to know, almost, I mean, and certainly only a sampling, but that I felt close to, that there was always a period of that sort of was troublesome, like of having and made worse by the fact that am I a veteran? Who cares? So it was like
right.
compounded. I know we have a question from Susan.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I know you mentioned that you had help from a surgeon and everything, but I was wondering how you got the medical of being in the hospital on a battlefront so incredibly accurate, because it was amazing how much, picking up the flag and all that other stuff that you brought in, and I was really impressed by that. I had trouble reading it because it took me back to working in a big city ER, but though not this horrific, How did you know all that?
Well, thank you so much, Susan, because I mean, like I said, every single scene in this book was frightening to write. I mean, literally, because it was so important to me to be as right as I could, because I knew that if and where I failed, that would, sort of let sunlight in on the book wasn't accurate. And I really wanted it to be accurate. That being said, of course, I'm not a nurse, I'm not a doctor. But what I do, I mean, my job is I read, huge amounts of research, huge amounts of information. I read memoirs, I read all of these different things, and then I go and I research whatever actual procedure I'm talking about. And then my job is to kind of make what's happening be less important than how she's feeling about it, and to sort of put it through that funnel of how do I create the world that I'm trying to create and the woman that I'm trying to create, and still be accurate. And it's interesting. I find that I'm more likely to get the surgery right and the forceps wrong, or some little instrument, that's what I'm going to screw up, is some little thing somewhere. But fortunately, Diane's husband, Mike, was very helpful, because I had one scene that was apparently just plain wrong. And he emailed me and he said, Kristin, it's just plain wrong. She can't do this. She can't do this. She would not be allowed to do this. He said, you just need to cut the scene. And I said, I can't cut the scene, because the scene is the moment where, and I'm trying to remember what it is now. It's the moment where Frankie comes into her own as a nurse, and I have to have her do something that nobody at home would think she could do, and that she didn't think she could do. And so he said, okay, here, let me help you. And he kind of guided me through that one.
Bill, you rejoined us. Sorry, go ahead, Daria.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think Bill might have his sound working.
Oh,
Yeah, I switched computers. Kristin, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hi, Bill.
Okay, yeah. Good evening. I'm Bill Sugarts. I'm a docent at the Vietnam Memorial, and a Vietnam veteran from 69-70, and a personal friend of Diane's. And so I'm thrilled to meet you. Your book is terrific. It's outstanding. I'm a docent at the Army Museum, and I tell everybody about your book, and I say, you got to read this book. And but what's interesting to me, what got me immediately when I read it, the realism you have, the resourcing you've got, it is very, very real. And then the two worlds coming back and having the lack of respect, no matter what we did. And the nurses were angels, the donut dollies were angels. We would be out in these fire bases, and these donut dollies would come out in these blue dresses, and the helicopter wash would put their dresses up, and I said to a donut dolly that I've known for years now, I said, why'd you wear skirts? And she said, Bill, we never wore skirts. They were culottes. And but anyway, they were the only, and I don't want to be sexist, but GI talk, they were the only round-eyed women we would see. So it's just really special to talk to you. And I thank you very much for doing this. And your comment about no women in Vietnam. I mean, I started as a docent in 2007, and I had young people say, no, there weren't any women in Vietnam. And I said, oh, yeah, there were. There were easily 7,500 nurses and donut dollies and administrators, and easily 10,000. So thank you very much.
I think, good. I just wanted to chime in with the fact that I think, because I did look up the numbers, because I thought maybe they would come up. I mean, they're, depending on where you look, their estimates are between 10 to 11,000 nurses served in Vietnam, and 600 plus donut dollies served. So that's a lot of women.
Right. But I think the interesting point to note as well is they're not exactly sure.
Right.
Because they weren't really tracking them as closely as they needed to be. So.
Yeah, and I will add that I did an interview once with General Pat Foote, who is now deceased, but she was she made it to be a general. But when she went to Vietnam, she went with, and this was a point you mentioned in your book, which I found this so perfect because it totally tracked. She was with nylons, not pantyhose, and heels. And she was one of the first women who was in the public affairs in Saigon. And she said after that experience, she came back and she made sure that she needed to, learn, because the whole time she was there, she didn't know anything. She didn't know how to fire a weapon. She didn't know anything like that. And, that was kind of like her mission as she continued her career. Anyway, Sean, do we have other questions? I want to include everyone who might have something to say or offer a story.
Lots more chat, lots more praise for the book. Gretchen says, we wore skirts. She was a Donut Dolly in 66, 67. We wore skirts at first until we convinced Mary Lou that it was difficult to get onto a helicopter.
Justin Miller has his hand up.
Justin, I'll ask you to unmute. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
I put it in the chat. Do you ever remember a lady named Donna Rowe?
I don't think so.
We did a documentary here out of Texas called In the Shadow of the Blade, and reunited a nurse from, I think it was
I can't hear you, Justin.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
If you can't hear him, Kristin, it's a bit echoey.
Can you hear
Justin.
him, Sean?
I can hear him. Justin, go ahead. What's your question?
Anyway, name was Donna Rowe. She was a nurse out of the 3rd Field Hospital. And some of my constituents flying helicopters brought her a baby named Kathleen. And I got to meet her when we reunited her with the grown-up woman who was now going to be a nurse.
So Donna Rowe was a nurse.
Donna Rowe was a nurse at the.
Can you ask the question, Sean? Because I can't hear. He's cutting in and out for me.
Maybe Sean can relay.
Closer.
Oh, that might help.
Is this any better?
That's better. I hope.
Anyway, Donna Rowe was a nurse at the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon.
Oh.
Medevac brought her a baby that they found in a pile of people, and she did everything she wasn't supposed to do. She and the doc brought the baby back to life, never saw the baby again. Then when we did the documentary, we reunited the nurse, the baby, the pilot, and the doctor. I don't think I've ever cried that much in my life, but that was about the time we were funding the Women's Memorial too. So, they were women. They were always women, and the nice thing we got to do, I got to do, was to be brought into the organization of Dwellsback Hospital nurses and given 2 different challenge coins over the course of the years. That was 25th Division. So, but they were always that way. I'm glad for the title. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's what a great story. Thank you for sharing that.
Greg Yost, you put something into the chat. I thought you might want to ask that question.
Yes, thank you so much for this program. I haven't read the book or picked it up, but I think I'm going to have to do that. Thank you so much for this. This is a very Vietnam medical question that sort of is a little outside your book, but maybe your book covers it. My question is about the notion of triage in a hospital. That is, you divide them into 3 categories. These people who are going to make it, those people who aren't going to make it, and you put the maximum effort into that middle category of people who are on the brink there. Did the U.S. practice that in U.S. Army hospitals in Vietnam? And are there cases where Vietnamese or even VC were sort of treated, even though there were sort of injured U.S. soldiers on the side who didn't get treatment because of the V's? One of the chat questions talked about a U.S. nurse who was killed in an Army hospital, murdered in an Army hospital by a VC patient. That's what got me thinking. You know anything about that angle of the hospital treatment in Vietnam?
Obviously, I'm not the best. There's probably, people in the chat that are better able to answer this question than I am. I can tell you that, yes, they did triage. And it was actually a very difficult, that was going back to Susan's question, that was one of the places that was difficult for me, just trying to figure out just how triage and where triage and who made it through and that sort of thing. But they definitely did do it. And of course they did treat Vietnamese civilians. How that factored in triage, I don't know. Maybe
Greg, I'm sure there are several nurses here in the room that could probably answer this question as well in the chats. Greg, take a look there. People are saying Pat Foot is living. I'm seeing a lot of chat. Pat Foot is
Okay.
is living.
I stand
Major
corrected.
Foot.
Thank you.
They're like, everybody knows she's alive.
She's amazing.
Alive.
Okay, thank you.
Let me do our quick station break. It won't take but a minute here, but I want to quickly thank our sponsor. Let me flip over to that particular screen. We want to thank tobacco-free Adagio Health for sponsoring tonight's program. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. There we go. Thank you, Tobacco-Free Adagio Health. They are dedicated to preventing and reducing tobacco use, educating people about tobacco hazards, and advocating for healthier places to live, work, and play. Find out everything there is to know about them at tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. We'd also like to thank UPMC for Life. They can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life has plans designed for veterans by veterans that can save you money and get you more benefits. You can view all of your plan options by going to upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. Thank you both for sponsoring the VBC. Because we have such a great turnout tonight, I want to definitely let people know that we have a free quarterly magazine through the Veterans Breakfast Club. This is free. All we need is your address. Send it to myself, Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. Get in touch with me, put it into the chat. We're happy to send this out to you quarterly. It's filled with a lot of the veteran stories that we hear. This most recent issue, the summer issue, is filled with stories that we heard on our Thursday night programs. It focused heavily this year on the Masters of the Air. If you didn't watch it on Apple Plus, it's phenomenal. But we have many, including Ed Cottrell here in the room with us tonight, 102-year-old P-47 pilot. I could be wrong on that, Ed, but hopefully not. Ed, you just recently went with VBC on our UK Masters of the Air tour. We were so happy to have you a part of that. Happy to have you in the room here tonight. But again, for those of you new to the VBC, please check out our magazine. It's the best way we have to get out the word about what we do and our wonderful mission. We have a survey that I will put into the chat. It takes 2 minutes to answer. It just lets us know how we're doing, what we can do better. We watch these very closely, and we always appreciate it if you take just 2 minutes to fill it out here online. I will put that link into the chat for you all. And that's all from me. Back to you, Daria.
Hi. Well, I see some hands raised, so let's go to Bill Honfer.
Bill, I'll ask you to unmute. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay. Hey, I just wanted to comment on the triage question. We definitely did have that in 12th of Act Hospital in Cu Chi. When I got in there after 11 months in country, I had a broken leg, and they kind of recognized that, pushed me off to the side, and fixed up some bullet wounds first on some other people, and then brought me back. So I was in that middle category, I guess. And yeah, they did use the triage method over there. It was 12th of Act in Cu Chi. I heard one gentleman mention the 25th there. That was at Cu Chi also.
Thank you. And
thank you for the book. I've seen a lot of people around here. I'm in a retirement village. Seen a lot of people around here actually reading it. And I told them it's a great book, although I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But anyhow.
Wow. And so I think Don has his hand raised as well.
Yes, I do.
Go ahead, Don.
Okay, great. I look forward to reading your book. I just ordered it from the library, of course, in big print, so that certainly helps a lot of us nowadays. But my question is, did you view the TV series China Beach about the Vietnam nurses?
You know, I remember watching it when it was on. And actually, I tried to watch it while I was doing research for all of this. And I couldn't find it streaming anywhere. So hopefully, I would love it if Netflix or Amazon or somebody brought it back, because I thought it was, I enjoyed it. But I wouldn't call it research for me.
I'd like to do something now. Maybe I was thinking, Sean, I'm going to ask you I'm just going to say something, and then you can put up those pictures. Because just one of the things about at the end of the book that, again, it's so clear, there's no ambiguity about it, but you really show it, and you show it through the pain and you mentioned it, the women who came back. And again, I've met these women, and so it's just rings so true. They came back like Frankie. When Frankie came, she has her difficulties as she comes back. No plot spoilers, but at the end, she finds a way to kind of again connect with doing something that's larger than herself. In the very end, I don't want to give it away, but I think that's what the and I know there were more. I'm just going to mention the three women who I know, which include Diane Carlson Evans and Joan Fury and Peggy Michelanos, who did those things. And I thought, Sean, you could show those pictures now.
Sure, here we go.
So that's Joan, and I think she was at the Joan, she was at the 71st evac hospital in Pleiku. And so next picture. And there she is. She started, was one of the women who started and was the first director of the Center for Women Veterans at the VA. And that was so important because without that, you wouldn't have had the inroads to help the next generation of women, Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who returned. And that made a huge difference. And she did that just out of her own experiences. Next. And so I believe that's Diane Carlson Evans at the, what?
I think it is.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, but I think, and I think that's also at the 71st evac hospital. And so if you go to the next photo, Kristin, you can speak to this as well, but there she is. I mean, after 10 years, when she wanted to start a women's memorial, a Vietnam veterans memorial for women, I mean, she literally got death threats. And 10 years later, now we have it, and everyone loves it. And in the next picture, that's Peggy Michelanos, who was at she was at an evac hospital in the Mekong Valley, and that's her and she just happened to greet and find a soldier whose life she had saved. And so if you go to the next picture, which is one of my favorites, that's Peggy, and that's Shannon Morgan, who served as a lioness in Iraq in 2003. And she was sent out into direct ground combat with the Marines. And when she returned, she was told, well, you're not a combat veteran, because her MOS was as a mechanic. Anyway, so she suffered a great deal, but in the end, it was Peggy and other women at the VA who were nurses in Vietnam who helped her. So I just wanted to mention that. We can go back.
When, excuse me, when I guess in this summer, Diane asked me to do an event with her in her hometown of Helena. And so, of course I said yes. My husband and I flew out there. And as they were letting, people into the auditorium, Diane and I were standing there, and this woman came running over, and she had a big photograph pinned to her chest. And she went to Diane and she said, "This was my brother, and he wanted me to tell you that you saved his life. And he's never been able to thank you. And so I get to." I mean, it's amazing. And it's so great to be able to hear these stories. I'm really honored. So thank you.
Yeah. And I think that's important. It's why these stories matter.
Yeah.
It's why they matter. So I see, Dan, you have your hand up.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was a medical officer in the emergency room at the 71st evac hospital, 1967 to 68. I got there in October. Hospital's about a month or two old. It was a 350-bed hospital. And what was interesting was there is triage in the emergency room. I worked in the emergency room. We admitted many cases, mainly a lot of malaria, which nobody even thinks about. Must have admitted 1,000 cases of malaria, and that took men out of the field as much as the gunshot wounds. And an interesting incident occurred when a convoy was ambushed, and they brought in the soldiers who had been injured, as well as some of the NVA in the same emergency room.
I'm sorry, Dan, hold on one sec. Dan, let me unmute you again. So sorry, Dan.
In other words,
Go ahead.
what do you do as far as treating? Well, the surgeon and neurosurgeon triaged them in, and people who were salvageable, and I hate to use that word, they did as fast as they could. And the people who were dying, you got to understand, 98% of the people came to the emergency room survived, but they were taken so fast off the battlefield by the helicopters, within 20 minutes, they were in the emergency room. And some of these people would have died in the field if, and most of them, all of them were, most we brought in were salvaged. But the point was, a lot of these people would not have survived if they were in the field for half an hour or two. The golden hour, they were brought into the emergency room, we saved them. If they were out in the field for a period of time, they didn't make it sometimes. So that there is triage in the emergency room. The answer to the question was brought up before, and they did everything they could to save people's lives, and they did a lot of saving because that's a very high percentage rate in that war, at 98% salvage in the emergency room once they got there. So I just wanted you to make you known about that. That's on your thing is a beautiful novel. The nurses were great. And in fact, I had an incident where about 18 years ago, one of the nurses was awarded the Bronze Star for her service in that hospital, retroactive to when she was there in 67, 68. So the Army's always thinking of the nurses. It's becoming more prevalent at this time. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Dan.
I have a question about one of the scenes in one of the evac hospitals, because this was very moving when Frankie looks up and there are what you come to realize are escaped prisoners of war who had been carrying someone, and your description of their dehydration and their just exhaustion and that kind of like stare, and they like they're hollowed out somehow. I was wondering if was that based on a story, or did you conjure that, or?
I'm pretty sure that came from my conversations with Diane. I think she relayed some kind of an incident like that to me.
Wow, because I never heard a story like that before, and it just, gave me yeah, goosebumps, really. It was very, very intense. And so when you were at the memorial, when you went last year with Diane, and were people still telling stories at the story?
Yeah, I mean, they have a podium set up, and they did it in the evening, and it was Washington, D.C. in November. It was freezing cold, and there were 200 people there, and we heard from women vets from other wars, and Linda Vandervander's daughter spoke. So it was just this various collection of just remembering, and I don't know, it's such it's so important. I mean, I just had my dad's celebration of life last weekend, and so it makes me think of that, people standing up and telling their stories about how something or someone affected them, and in hearing those stories, we are reminded and we are changed. And so I think that's what memorials are for, and why they're so important, and why Diane fought so hard for it.
Yeah, no, she fought
chat,
yeah.
Sorry,
yes.
go ahead, in
go
the
ahead,
chat,
Sean.
Pam Ludwig says, "I'm a real good friend of your godmother, Barb." So she
Oh!
speaks so highly of you. So I just spoke with her the other day, and she said she talked to you on Saturday. I unmuted Terry, who was a nurse in Afghanistan and Iraq, who had a chat. Terry, are you there?
Yeah, I was a PA.
PA. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. So I was a child when Vietnam was going on, and my mom did a great job of sheltering us, from the war. The only thing I really remember is when the POWs were coming home. And then later I joined the military, and years later I became a PA and I deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I want to say that your book is amazing and spot on. If I didn't know it was historical fiction, I would swear it was a nonfiction book. It's that well written. Um, uh, the only thing that your book can't describe, it can't give the sounds and the smells that come with the horrors of war, from a medical aspect. Um, and I read your book, and then I read Diane's book, and I also met her last November at um, Veterans Day because she was the guest speaker, and I have a girl crush for her. But reading her book, I just can't imagine what she went through. She did what she did, in the OR, in the hospital, 10 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours. It's not like a schedule because you don't know when the patients are coming in, and that's so realistic. But when you're in a hospital like she was, that's where they go to get their surgery and become more stabilized. Fortunately, we've kind of improved that where we can stabilize them somewhat on the ground at the POI, the point of injury, as well as getting them to the closest medical facility to get stabilized and then onto the hospital if needed. But to go through all that day in and day out, and you can't get out of that without being affected, seeing that much trauma. And it's just spot on. And I want to thank you for writing that book.
Thank you so much. I mean, thank you so much. And I think when you look at it from like the nurse and doctor perspective of going to war, you're going as caretakers. I mean, that's the kind of person you are. That's you want to help people. And so I can't even imagine the emotional toll. I mean, I obviously try to explore it, but I don't think there's any way, absent experiencing it to truly understand it.
Well, and also from
Sorry.
a woman's perspective, in a man's army, you have to be stronger, because then if you're not, then you're the weak woman. Yeah. Thank you.
Point, Terry.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Terry.
And before we're
Thanks.
going to wrap up, I know I've Dave Sieber here. I had a couple pictures of Dave. Are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to bring up your picture here. Here you are.
Yeah, that's me in the background there. Yeah, that was 2007. That is at the 386 Contingency Air Medical Staging Facility in Kuwait. So we were getting patients from Iraq and Afghanistan. We just had an air-based clinic. So the hospital was actually at Camp Arif John, on the other side of Kuwait City from us. So the Air Force flew them in, the Army transported them to the hospital where the Navy took care of them, and then they would send them back to us. And, we were kind of the middlemen there, moving them through the air medical evacuation system. And that was the crew I worked with in Afghanistan. You can see there are two men there. There were actually three male nurses in Kuwait, but just myself and Sean Ryan, the other guy there in the back row on the left. So that was Afghanistan in 2010 during the surge. So yeah, somebody put in the chat talking about seeing it every day. Wow. Yeah, that's true. We probably saw more trauma in a week than some trauma centers see in a year.
Wow.
Yeah, and trying to move these, my job, we're getting these guys and gals in and we're trying to get them out. I remember many nights literally standing in the door of the OR, asking the surgeon, hey, is this guy going to be done in time that we can get him on the aircraft tonight to get him out of here? You know, and it looked like somebody poured buckets of blood on the floor.
I wanted to, thank you, Dave. I wanted to see if Diane Cameron was still on. Oh, hi, Diane. Can you unmute Diane?
Yes.
So, Diane, I'm so glad you're here because I think you have a very interesting story to tell of your visit to the Army base at Vung Tau.
Yes, I had an all-girl rock and roll band that went to Vietnam during the war in 1967, and there were 4 of us, and we were working in Vung Tau, entertaining the troops. And one day, one of the I don't know who he was, but he was in the Army. But anyway, he said, "Would you like to go and visit the wounded in the 36 evac hospital?" And we said, "Sure, absolutely." So, and we were like 22 and 23 years old, 21 also. And so we decided we would go and see them. And we got in his little Jeep and he took us over there and dumped us off at the front of the building. And we were going, oh my gosh, can we really do this? We were starting to get scared because we didn't know what was in there, what we were going to face. And I just said, well, you know, we're here. Let's go in. And so we were met at the door by the nurses and they welcomed us in. And they took us to all the hospital. It was a great big room, and there were like maybe 4 rows of wounded GIs. And so we each took a row and we went down and talked to whoever wanted to talk with us. And the row that I was looking left and right to see, you know, who wanted to talk to me. So some saw I was coming and they just turned their head to the side, and I knew not to bother them. But this one guy, he waved me over. So I said, okay, I get to talk to somebody. And he was great. Big guy, must have, you know, he probably Army or Marine, I guess, I don't know. But his name was John. And we were talking for a while, and he said to me, will you always remember me? And I said, of course I'll always remember you. And he said, you know, all I want is somebody to remember that we were here in this mess of a war. We shouldn't be here. This is not our fight. And he said, but we're here and we're doing the best we can. And he said, are you sure that you're going to remember me? And I said, John, I will always remember you. And I made that promise in 1967. And I've thought of him almost constantly. And I'm writing my own book. It's about my band. We were in Thailand for two weeks, working at the Air Force bases there. And then we shipped over to Vietnam, and we traveled the country in Vietnam. And we worked sometimes 1 show a day to maybe 4 shows a day at different locations. We were all over that place. And they did want to take us up to Pleiku, but it was on alert, which means we could not go. It was way too dangerous for us. So we played 130 shows in 3 months. And so we really, really worked hard. We got good response. They were so happy to see us. And some of the GIs said, we haven't seen a round eye in like 2 or 3 years. And so, well, you know, and they enjoyed our show. We did a lot of the Motown things from the Supremes and a lot of other hard rock and roll. And we had those, especially the privates, we had those joints jumping. They were so happy to see us. They were dancing, they were singing, and they thought we were the greatest. And it was a good feeling because we were doing a good job and we did our best. And it was an honor for us to be there.
My gosh, thank you so much, Diane, for sharing that with us.
You're quite
I just, before we go, I just want to, Sean, can you quickly see, is Becky Nava?
Becky
In-
Nava, let me check.
She might not be.
I do not see a Becky
Okay.
Nava, no.
All right. Well,
I do see Ben Wright's hand raised. Ben?
oh, okay.
Yeah, another hazard that nurses in Vietnam were exposed to that we had mentioned so far was Agent Orange. We had a lady who was an Army nurse at Long Binh in Vietnam who was very active in Veterans Breakfast Club. She died a few years back as a result of her exposure to Agent Orange. And she also suffered a lot from post-traumatic stress. In fact, she and another lady put together a marvelous book, the combination of poetry and art that they did. But her big frustration when she came home was the same thing that was mentioned. I mean, she essentially, as a nurse, was doing surgery because they didn't have enough doctors. And before long, she was able to do things that the young physicians that were there couldn't do. And then she came home, came back to Pittsburgh, working in a hospital. She couldn't do anything without permission, and sitting there watching doctors trying to do things that she could do better than they could. But, you know, because she was young, but they didn't realize the experience and what went on in at Long Binh.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, that's
You're welcome.
exactly
can I just-
resonates.
Can I ask one question real quick? Because I don't want to get cut off. Is there a way for me to read the chat somehow? Can I
will,
hear?
Yeah, there's a lot that you probably would like to look at. I get a link at the very end, and I'd be happy to send you that text file so that you can see. And if there's anybody that you'd like to reach out to, we can see what we need to do that. Daria and I can help out with that. I know we're at time, and I know that I'm in a different view, so I may have missed a lot of people's hands. I apologize. Please go ahead, Kristin.
Well, I just want to say, you know, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your service. I'm honored to be speaking to you guys, and I'm really grateful that I got the chance to write this book.
Well, we're so thrilled that you were here. And I just I'll just say I think it's Elena Nava whose hand is up. She's the lioness. I don't know, we have time for a quick.
Sure.
I'll ask you to unmute, Elena. Thank you, Kristin. Elena, you
Hello.
Hi.
Yes.
Is that Becky?
Yes, hi Daria. Sorry, I'm
Hi.
under my daughter's profile.
Okay. I just thought it would be interesting for you to we're at the end of our time, but if you could just quickly say how, you know, what it meant for you to have the Center for Women Veterans and have that the women who had served in Vietnam, nurses who had sort of paved the way to help you when you came back.
Absolutely, they were amazing. It was a pleasure and an honor to meet them. The Center for Women Veterans, they assisted me tremendously with my VA claim. After it was initially denied because I was told that as a woman veteran, I did not have anything to claim, that I did not experience any PTSD, and that I didn't know what combat was after serving almost 13 months out there. And I was completely distraught. I didn't know where or who to turn to. And after speaking at a conference, I had somebody come up and approach me and help me and guide me and assist me through the way. And ever since then, I have been so appreciative, and I have assisted and guided other female veterans through the process. And she's been a total angel. And
I love that story.
Absolutely. And
I just want to say, Becky is one of the stars in the film I made with Meg McLagan called Lioness, about the women who served in combat. And what really is so meaningful to me about this program, and that what Kristin's book does. It's just like the story, and you can see through the different generations of women helping women and how it makes a difference. And I think maybe that's a good note to end this on. So, Kristin, thank you from everyone at the Veterans Breakfast Club. Thank you so, so much. It has been a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys.
And thank you, Becky.
You're welcome. Thank you, Daria.
Thank you,
All
everyone,
right.
for coming. Please come next Monday. We will have Tony Swafford, the author of Jarhead. If you've seen the movie Jarhead with Jake Gyllenhaal, that was based on his book, an incredible book. We'll have him on next Monday. Thank you so much, Kristin, for joining us. We hope to see you again.
I hope so.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.